Welcome back. This episode is going to take a lot longer than I normally would like, but I thought it important to review the historical background and review some of the significant events that led up to the four confrontations and ultimately led to the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. So, if you think you know the history pretty well up to 1774, you probably want to skip this episode and move on to part 3, where I go into the confrontations. If you don't know the history, please continue watching, so you'll have a better understanding of the events leading up to each confrontation.
You probably remember that the Revolutionary War started because the British government imposed high taxes, strict laws, and exercised cruel treatment on the American colonists. And these taxes and laws caused the American colonists to revolt. All true. But why? Well, it all starts after the end of what we call the French and Indian War in 1765. Britain needed to figure out a way to pay for the war against France, and to pay for the salaries of the British troops and officials that were now permanently stationed in British North America. And since the war was fought in North America with British troops to remove the French, which ultimately was for the benefit of the American colonists, the British Parliament figured it was only fair to impose taxes against the colonies to help pay their fair share. And so, for the very first time, several heavy taxes were imposed on the American colonists. Between 1765 and 1773, a whole bunch of taxes came down the pike, one after the other, aimed straight at the Americans. The Stamp, Sugar, Townsend, Tea, and Intolerable Acts were some of the big ones. In Boston, these high taxes seemed to be solely directed at them, and many felt that it was intended to punish only them. And it provoked many Bostonians into street protests against all British authority, especially when more British troops arrived to keep order in the city. But that still was not enough to pay for the huge debt that Britain had incurred. The Stamp and Sugar Acts were closely followed by the 1767 Townsend Acts. These were a collection of laws that set new import taxes on British goods, and the money raised from these taxes would be used to maintain British troops that were stationed in America and to continue to pay the salaries of some officials who were appointed to work in the 13 colonies for the king. In Boston, those additional high taxes provoked many Bostonians into street protests against all British authority, especially when more British troops arrived to keep order in the city.
The local Sons of Liberty group, led by Sam Adams, the beer guy, organized and started many of the street protests against the Massachusetts Bay provincial governor and the British troops.
It was during one of these street protests, on March 5th, 1770, that a local street mob gathered at the Boston Customs House, the place where British collected taxes. And this mob began to antagonize and threaten a lone British sentry. When the British Army detachment was called out to restore order, the protesters escalated the situation by throwing snowballs and insults at the troops. At some point, the British troops fired on the mob, killing 5 colonists. Many of you know this incident as the Boston Massacre. The word got out to the rest of the 13 colonies, primarily thanks to the efforts of Paul Revere's leaflets that he engraved, printed, and distributed. One can only imagine what this incident did to fan the flames of the rebellion to the rest of the colonies. To restore order and peace, the provincial governor routinely called out British troops to restore order in the streets of Boston. And, routinely, the British soldiers had to endure many of the street protesters, hurling insults and sometimes eggs or even rocks at them, and antagonizing the hell out of those British soldiers.
But the two really big acts that changed everything and planted the seeds of rebellion in the colonies was the Tea Act in 1773, followed closely by the Coercive Acts, or what we call the Intolerable Acts, in 1774.
The Tea Act forced American colonists to drink only British tea, shipped from Britain, and then taxed the hell out of it at the same time. In direct response to the Tea Act, a major street protest was organized on December 16, 1773, in Boston, and led by Sam Adams. A large group of local Sons of Liberty members, badly disguised as native Mohawks, boarded several ships full of British tea docked in Boston Harbor, and threw the cargo of tea overboard into the harbor. Today, most of you know this incident as the Boston Tea Party. Again, by the time British soldiers arrived on scene to restore order and arrest the protesters, most of the protesters had already scattered into the streets, and the soldiers were left to insults and egg throwing from the locals.
All this did was ratchet up the British soldier frustration and bitterness toward the colonials, and a deep hatred was growing by leaps and bounds on both sides.
After the events of the Boston Tea Party and the general agitation in all of the colonies, King George III knew he had to reassert control and authority in the Americas. So he personally directed that Parliament enact the Coercive Acts in early 1774.
So the Coercive Acts were specifically meant to punish Boston for their actions during the Tea Party, and several of the measures were designed to isolate the city from the world. First, it authorized the closure and blockade of the port of Boston to all commerce. And second, it authorized a significant increase of British troops in Boston to maintain order.
To the rest of the colonies, these actions were seen as abusive and oppressive by Britain. But the measures that really enraged the rest of the colonies were the provisions in the Coercive Acts that dissolved local assemblies, banned town meetings, and made it illegal to hold local elections. From here on out, only British Crown officials would rule the colonies. It was clear that King George wanted to punish all 13 colonies because of their defiance towards the Crown. They saw the handwriting was on the wall, and they knew their turn would come next.
So are you getting the picture? Pissed off and physically mistreated colonials versus very angry, bitter, and hugely frustrated British soldiers. Sounds like a recipe for violence to me.
Parliament also appointed General Thomas Gage as the military governor of Massachusetts and charged him with the enforcement of the Intolerable Acts. He arrived in Boston on May 14, 1774, with about 4,000 troops, which, over time, increased to about 6,000 troops, all based in Boston. The residents of the Massachusetts Bay Colony became very alarmed of the magnitude of British troops that were amassing in Boston and began to organize themselves militarily against the British buildup. This colonial military preparation came in the form of increasing and better training each of the town's militia in order to better protect themselves from any future British brutality. The other major preparation that each town undertook was to acquire and store ammunition and military supplies needed for any kind of fighting, if it came to it. This included the acquisition of muskets, musket balls, cannons, and most importantly, gunpowder. General Gage got wind of colonial military preparations, and he immediately determined that his purpose was to remove from Patriot hands the means of violent resistance, until a time when cooler heads would prevail. To this end, Gage proposed to disarm New England by a series of small surgical operations, meticulously planned, secretly mounted, and carried forward with minimal use of force. His objective was not to provoke a war, but to prevent one. He began to plan a series of missions against the arsenals and powder houses of New England. His concept was designed to remove as much munitions as possible from the locations of major colonial stockpiles, especially powder or gunpowder. He wanted to make it impossible for New Englanders to make a determined fight against him and British authority. But his plan would only succeed if he could conduct the raids by total surprise. And it was this plan that would set off a series of confrontations between overconfident Massachusetts and New Hampshire colonial towns versus very frustrated and angry British authority in America. And the outcomes of these four events would eventually lead to American bloodshed at the battles of Lexington and Concord, and igniting the American Revolutionary War. Frustrated British troops, overconfident American colonists, four confrontations. What could go wrong? Find out where they took place and when they took place, and what their outcomes were when you come back and check out Part 3 of The Powder Alarms. If you've liked watching this episode of The Powder Alarms, please hit like or subscribe so you can keep up with new episodes as they become available. And don't forget to check out the riding maps of the motorcycle routes I plan that takes you to these places. They will be posted at the very end of the last episode of the series. Thanks for watching.